A perfectly functional multi-million-dollar locomotive, one that could run for decades more, gets deliberately cut into scrap metal instead of being sold. Why would any business destroy a working asset worth more than most people will earn in a lifetime? In an industry where a single new unit can take over a year to deliver, and buyers around the world are desperate for used power, America's largest railroads would still rather send a locomotive to the scrapyard than let it fall into a competitor's hands? That single decision to destroy rather than sell reveals more about how the freight rail industry really operates than any earnings report ever could. A modern mainline diesel-electric locomotive is anything but disposable. The price of a new unit routinely lands between $2 and $5 million, depending on horsepower, emissions compliance, and onboard technology. For a railroad, this is not just another piece of rolling stock. It is a capital investment, often more expensive than most single-family homes and built to last far longer. The expected service life for these machines stretches across 2 or even 3 decades. Many will run 3 or 4 million miles before their last trip, with major overhauls scheduled at the halfway mark to extend their usefulness. Replacing one of these engines is not a matter of picking up the phone and ordering a replacement. Manufacturers such as Wabtec and Progress Rail operate with full order books, and a new build typically takes anywhere from 12 to 24 months to deliver. Custom configurations like dual-mode power or advanced emissions kits can push the wait even longer. During this time, the railroad faces a gap in hauling capacity, a risk that only grows as freight demand fluctuates and regulatory requirements tighten. Even the process of keeping an aging locomotive in service comes with steep costs. A full rebuild, including engine overhaul, traction motor replacement, and software upgrades, can run anywhere from $500,000 to nearly $2 million per unit. Union Pacific's recent fleet modernization, for example, saw more than $1 billion spent upgrading 600 older locomotives, averaging nearly $1.7 million per rebuild. These investments buy more years of service, but they also reflect the high bar for what counts as end of life in this industry. On the used market, a well-maintained locomotive with life left in it might fetch $200,000 or more. But that is a fraction of the original purchase price, and only for units that are still mechanically sound and compliant with current emission standards. The secondary market is thin, with most buyers, short lines, and regional carriers having limited capital and specific needs. For mainline operators, the calculus is stark. Every locomotive scrapped represents millions in sunk cost and a long, expensive path to replacement. This is why the decision to destroy a working locomotive instead of selling it is so striking. It defies the logic of asset recovery seen in other industries, where used equipment is routinely resold, repurposed, or parted out. In freight rail, the locomotive is an anchor of operational capacity, expensive to acquire, slow to replace, and essential for moving goods across the continent. Scrapping a unit is not a casual choice. It is a move made with full awareness of the cost, the replacement timeline, and the value left on the table. What then could drive a railroad to take such a step? The answer lies deeper, in the intersection of competition, technology, and the defensive instincts that shape the industry. On the surface, the destruction of a working locomotive appears almost wasteful, especially given the steady demand for used power in the broader rail market. Across North America, short line and regional railroads, leasing companies, and even some overseas buyers are eager to acquire second-hand locomotives. These operators often lack the capital for new builds, so a retired mainline engine, especially one that is recently overhauled, represents a rare opportunity to boost hauling capacity at a fraction of the cost. Listings for mid-generation units, such as the EMD SD42 or GP38-2, regularly command prices from $30,000 up to $250,000, depending on condition and upgrades. For many short lines, these machines are essential for reopening dormant routes or expanding service to new customers. Yet a locomotive's mechanical health and resale value are only part of the equation. The real puzzle is that so many units with years of potential service are deliberately removed from circulation. The appetite for used power is real, but the supply is tightly controlled. When a Class 1 railroad retires a locomotive, the decision to scrap is not just about wear and tear or emissions compliance. It is a calculated move that weighs the risks and rewards of letting another operator, sometimes a future competitor, put that same asset to work. In a market where new deliveries can take years and every locomotive counts, the act of scrapping becomes a way to limit access, preserve leverage, and avoid unintended consequences. Even as short lines and leasing firms stand ready to buy, the gates rarely open wide. The paradox deepens when considering that in other industries, used equipment routinely finds a second life. Airlines sell aging jets to cargo carriers, and trucking firms offload tractors to independents. But in freight rail, the secondary market remains thin and often unpredictable, shaped by the defensive instincts of the largest players. Exceptions do exist. Some retired units are exported to countries like Brazil or refurbished for continued use in niche domestic markets. These cases, however, are the outliers, reminders that while the appetite for used locomotives is genuine, the willingness to feed that demand is sharply limited by strategic priorities. The result is a market defined less by technical obsolescence and more by the careful management of scarcity. A used locomotive, even one with decades behind it, can be a powerful lever in the hands of a smaller railroad. For a short line or regional carrier, the difference between buying a new engine and acquiring a retired Class 1 unit is measured in millions of dollars. The price gap is not just a matter of accounting. It is the difference between expansion and stagnation, between serving new customers and watching them shift to trucks. In the world of freight rail, where capital is scarce and margins are thin, a second-hand locomotive is often the only practical way for a smaller operator to grow. Class 1 railroads, by contrast, hold the keys to the most lucrative corridors and the newest, most capable motive power. Their decisions about what to do with aging units are shaped less by the prospect of a modest resale than by the need to defend their position. Every locomotive that leaves the property is a potential source of new competition. A retired engine sold at a discount could end up on a regional carrier just down the line, helping that operator bid for traffic or reopen a dormant route. In an industry where every carload is contested, even a small shift in capacity can tip the balance. This is why disposition is rarely treated as a simple transaction. For the largest railroads, the question is not how much can be recovered from a used locomotive, but whether selling it would erode their own leverage. The calculus is defensive. Scrapping a unit eliminates the risk that it will reappear in the hands of a rival, competing for the same customers or undercutting rates. The logic is rooted in scarcity. Locomotives are not easily replaced, and the secondary market is thin by design. By removing viable power from circulation, a Class 1 railroad preserves its advantage, even if it means foregoing the limited cash that a sale might bring. Short lines and regional carriers, meanwhile, watch the flow of retired power with keen interest. Every unit scrapped is an opportunity lost, a reminder that in freight rail, the gates to growth are often closed not by technical limits, but by strategic intent. The rare exceptions, when a locomotive is sold or exported, only sharpen the point. Access is granted sparingly, and always on the terms of those who already control the tracks. A small fleet can redraw the map for a regional railroad. When a short line operator or a startup gains access to just 3 or 4 second-hand locomotives, the transformation is immediate and concrete. Suddenly, a corridor that once lay dormant, set aside by a larger carrier, can spring back to life. The mechanics are straightforward. The short line acquires surplus units, often through a broker or leasing firm specializing in retired Class 1 power. These intermediaries act as the bridge, sourcing units that have been cycled out of mainline duty but remain mechanically sound after overhaul. Take the case of the Indiana and Ohio Railroad reopening the Mechanicville corridor. 8 used GP382s, purchased for under $30,000 each, gave the operator the muscle to restore freight service where trucks had taken over. Within weeks, the line moved from idle rails to a 30% jump in carloads, serving grain elevators and small manufacturers left behind by the majors. The capital at stake was modest, about $216,000 for the entire locomotive roster. In the world of rail, that is a rounding error compared to the millions required for new Tier 4 power. But for the short line, it was the difference between expansion and obscurity. Brokers and leasing companies are the quiet enablers of these shifts. Firms like GATX and CIT buy up retired units, refurbish them, and lease them out to operators who could never afford new equipment. The process is fast, sometimes a matter of weeks from purchase to revenue service. That speed matters. When a corridor reopens, shippers have a new option overnight, and the balance of bargaining power on that route changes. Rates, service reliability, and even the threat of competition force the larger carriers to take notice. For the Class 1 railroad, watching a former asset reappear on a contested corridor is more than an irritation. It is a direct challenge to their control of the market. Every locomotive that slips through the secondary market represents a potential wedge, an opening for a rival to poach customers or revive dormant business. Scrapping, then, is not just about disposing of metal. It is about blocking these downstream moves before they start, ensuring that the only way to gain capacity is through the slow, expensive channel of new investment. The logic is defensive, but in a business built on scarcity and leverage, it is ruthlessly effective. Inside the shell of a modern locomotive, value is not just measured in steel or horsepower. The real secrets travel in the software, layers of proprietary code and embedded logic that turn a diesel engine into a rolling repository of operational know-how. These machines carry more than mechanical muscle. They are imprinted with the fingerprints of the railroad that ran them and the manufacturer that built them. Every control module, firmware update, and diagnostic tool is a product of years of engineering and real-world trial. What looks like just another engine actually holds a detailed record of how a railroad manages fuel efficiency, power output, and even the quirks of its routes. Manufacturers like Wabtec and Progress Rail guard their engine management algorithms closely. The firmware that controls throttle response, braking curves, and emissions compliance is often customized for each railroad, fine-tuned to match specific operational patterns. When a locomotive changes hands, that code goes with it. The risk is not just that a rival might gain another engine, it is that they could reverse engineer the software, learning exactly how a competitor squeezes more miles from a gallon of fuel, or how it diagnoses faults before they become failures. Even the way a railroad schedules maintenance. Data stored in onboard logs can reveal patterns that a savvy competitor could exploit. The threat of reverse engineering is not theoretical. Short-line operators and independent rebuilders have a history of extracting firmware from retired units, sometimes uncovering undocumented features or bypassing built-in restrictions. Legal boundaries exist, but unless the resale contract explicitly forbids tampering, the hardware becomes fair game. In the hands of a technically skilled buyer, a decommissioned locomotive is a blueprint for how the big players run their fleets. For a Class 1 railroad, the calculus is simple but ruthless. Scrapping a locomotive does not just remove a physical asset from circulation, it destroys a vessel of trade secrets. The cost of letting operational intelligence slip into a rival's shop is measured not in resale dollars lost, but in competitive advantage preserved. In an industry where every edge is guarded, the logic behind destruction becomes clear. Sometimes the real value is in what you keep hidden. Deep inside every modern locomotive, a silent witness rides along for every mile, the event recorder. This device, often called the black box of railroading, preserves a detailed trace of the engine's life, including speed at every moment, throttle settings, braking patterns, GPS-coordinated locations, and whether signals were obeyed or ignored. The data does not vanish when the locomotive is retired. Instead, it remains stored on internal memory, sometimes for years, holding a granular record of how the machine was operated and where it went. With the rise of positive train control, the digital footprint only grows. PTC, linked telemetry systems log even more: real-time compliance with movement authorities, remote diagnostics, and encrypted communications between locomotive, trackside equipment, and dispatch. For a railroad, these records are more than maintenance logs. They are operational blueprints, snapshots of company practice, and in some cases, evidence of how rules are interpreted in the field. The risk is not just about technology leaking out. It is about the exposure of patterns and vulnerabilities unique to each operator. Transferring a locomotive means transferring this data, or at the very least taking on the burden of sanitizing it. Wiping an event recorder or a PTC system is not as simple as deleting a file. It requires specialized tools, technical oversight, and sometimes coordination with the original manufacturer. If a railroad misses something, the new owner could gain access to confidential information, details about train handling, route-specific speeds, or regulatory compliance issues. In a worst-case scenario, sensitive logs could end up in the hands of a rival, a regulator, or a plaintiff's attorney after an accident. The cost and uncertainty around data sanitization add friction to every potential sale. For some, the risk outweighs the reward. Scrapping the unit becomes the cleanest solution, not just for disposing of steel and copper, but for erasing a digital trail that, if mishandled, could reveal far more than intended. In the world of freight rail, where operational intelligence is guarded as closely as physical assets, the event recorder transforms a used locomotive from a simple machine into a potential liability. A locomotive painted in the colors of a major railroad is more than machinery. It is a rolling advertisement, a symbol of reliability and corporate identity. Once that engine leaves the original owner's roster, however, the railroad loses all control over how it is maintained, operated, or even where it appears. The risk is not just mechanical, it is reputational. If a former Class 1 locomotive still wearing its old livery breaks down on a remote siding or worse, features in a derailment, the public and media rarely distinguish between current and former ownership. The reporting marks may have changed, but the paint tells a different story. Any incident, no matter who is at fault, can quickly be linked back to the original brand in headlines and regulatory filings. This is not a theoretical concern. Accident investigation reports from the past decade routinely list locomotives by their legacy numbers and paint schemes, even after multiple changes in ownership. In one high-profile case, a retired GE unit involved in a derailment still bore the markings of its first owner, drawing scrutiny and questions from both the press and federal investigators. The fallout from such events can reach far beyond the operator at fault. Lawsuits, insurance claims, and regulatory inquiries often circle back to the railroad whose name is still visible on the cab, regardless of who actually maintains or operates the unit. Maintenance history adds another layer of complexity. Once a locomotive is sold, its service records may become fragmented or incomplete. especially if it passes through brokers, or leasing firms. If a mechanical failure leads to an accident, investigators may struggle to determine whether a latent defect traces back to the original owner, or if it stems from later neglect. The ambiguity can expose the railroad to claims of negligence or faulty design, even years after the asset has left its control. Brand exposure, then, becomes a hidden liability. The calculus is simple. Scrapping a locomotive erases the risk that a faded logo will show up in the wrong place at the wrong time, attached to someone else's mistake. For railroads that have spent decades building a reputation for safety and reliability, the prospect of reputational blowback far outweighs the modest proceeds from a used sale. In an industry where public image and legal exposure are tightly linked, destruction can feel like the only safe option. In most heavy industries, the end of an asset's frontline life is only the start of its next chapter. Airlines routinely sell or lease older jets to cargo carriers, startups, or overseas operators. A Boeing 737 might fly passengers in North America for 2 decades, then spend another 10 years hauling freight across Asia or Africa. The aftermarket is so robust that entire companies specialize in converting passenger aircraft into freighters, stripping out seats, reinforcing floors, and updating avionics before sending them back into service. Even after their last flight, these planes are often dismantled for high-value engines and avionics, with components traded globally. Trucking operates much the same way. Long-haul tractors, after a few years of pounding the interstates, are sold to independent operators or smaller fleets. Used trucks fill auctions and dealer lots, often passing through 3 or 4 owners, before finally being parted out. The process is brisk and unremarkable. Selling, buying, and repurposing are simply how the business works. Maritime shipping takes it a step further. Ships that are no longer economical to operate on major routes are often repurposed as barges, storage hulks, or even floating hotels. When true end-of-life arrives, vessels are sent to shipbreaking yards where steel, copper, and machinery are salvaged. The global appetite for second-hand tonnage means that few ships are wasted. Freight rail, by contrast, stands apart. The resale of mainline locomotives is tightly controlled, and the flow of used power is more a trickle than a stream. While other industries treat asset turnover as routine, railroads guard their motive power with a defensive intensity. Scrapping is not just a way to dispose of the old. It is a strategy to prevent rivals from gaining a foothold. The result is a market where destruction is the norm, and resale is the rare exception, a pattern that reveals as much about the industry's mindset as it does about the machines themselves. Numbers on a balance sheet often tell a different story than the one written in steel and paint. At first glance, scrapping a locomotive worth millions in its prime looks reckless. But the math behind the decision is less emotional and more immediate than it appears. When a railroad sends a retired engine to the scrapyard, the cash recovered is modest, usually between $25,000 and $35,000, depending on the market price for steel and copper. That's just 5 to 7% of what the unit cost new. Yet, unlike a sale, scrap value arrives quickly and with few strings attached. There is no need to negotiate with buyers, arrange transport across the continent, or manage the paperwork that comes with changing hands. Every step in a sale, including inspection, certification, shipping, and legal review, eats into the proceeds, sometimes erasing any premium over scrap entirely. Depreciation shapes the ledger in ways that are not visible from the outside. Under United States tax law, railroads use accelerated depreciation schedules, often writing down the value of a locomotive over 10 to 15 years. When the time comes to retire the unit, whatever book value remains can be written off as a loss if it is scrapped, reducing the company's taxable income. Selling the locomotive, on the other hand, can trigger a taxable event, especially if the sale price exceeds the remaining book value. The result is a system where the cleanest financial outcome is often immediate destruction, not drawn-out negotiation. There is also an in-between path, parting out. Some locomotives are stripped for usable components, including traction motors, control modules, even cab assemblies, before the hulk is finally cut up. This approach can recover more value than pure scrap, especially when parts are scarce or compatible with newer models. But parting out takes time, storage space, and a ready market for the salvaged equipment. For finance and asset disposition managers, the calculus is simple. If the costs and risks of resale or parting out outweigh the quick certainty of scrap, the torch wins every time. The result is a process that looks cold from the outside, but is in fact a rational response to the economic realities of large-scale asset management. In 1980, the Staggers Rail Act swept away decades of federal control, handing the levers of pricing and asset management back to the railroads themselves. Before this turning point, government regulators dictated everything from freight rates to how quickly a railroad could retire a locomotive. The process of selling or scrapping a unit was tangled in red tape, and surplus engines often lingered in storage or found their way to smaller carriers by default. With deregulation, that inertia vanished. Class I railroads gained the freedom to shape their own fleets, cut unprofitable routes, and shed excess motive power with almost no outside interference. The new landscape rewarded scale and efficiency. A wave of mergers followed. Burlington Northern absorbed Santa Fe, Union Pacific took over Southern Pacific, and Conrail was split between CSX and Norfolk Southern. Each deal created sprawling systems with overlapping routes, yards, and most critically, locomotive fleets far larger than needed for the new, consolidated networks. The challenge was no longer how to keep enough engines in service, but how to avoid the drag of carrying too many. Redundant units became a liability, not an asset. With the regulatory handbrake released, railroads turned to fleet rationalization as a central strategy. Surplus locomotives were identified, and the logic of the era was simple. If a unit did not pull its weight, it did not belong on the roster. But selling off these engines was no longer the obvious move. The newly empowered Class I carriers saw that every locomotive sold could become a building block for a potential rival, especially as deregulation made it easier for new entrants, short lines, or regional upstarts to carve out a niche. The calculus shifted. Scrapping was not just about cleaning house. It was about denying competitors the tools to challenge the dominant players. Inside this concentrated environment, the idea of defensive scrapping took root. The value of a retired locomotive was measured less in resale dollars and more in market control. By sending surplus units straight to the torch, railroads ensured that capacity did not leak into the hands of competitors. It was a culture shaped by scarcity and caution, where the risk of empowering a rival outweighed the modest gains from a sale. The logic hardened with every merger and every round of fleet cuts. Efficiency was not just about running lean, it was about keeping the gates to growth firmly shut. The post-Staggers era also brought new financial tools. Accelerated depreciation schedules and tax write-offs made it even easier to justify scrapping over resale. The cash from a quick trip to the scrapyard, paired with a tidy accounting loss, often beat the hassle and risk of negotiating a sale. Environmental rules added another layer. Disposing of a locomotive through certified channels satisfied hazardous material requirements in one stroke, while a sale could drag the original owner into a web of future liability if the buyer failed to comply. This pattern became self-reinforcing. As Class I railroads grew bigger, the secondary market for used power grew thinner, and the norm of scrapping surplus units became institutionalized. The industry's defensive mindset, born out of deregulation and sharpened by consolidation, turned what might look like waste into a calculated move to protect market share. Exceptions, when they occurred, stood out all the more. a handful of retired units exported overseas, a rare sale to a short line. But these were outliers, reminders that the default instinct was not to share, but to shield. The destroy not sell logic was not an accident or a quirk of policy. It was the product of a market where control trumped recovery, and where every locomotive kept out of a rival's hands was a quiet victory in the long game of freight rail competition. Fleet retirement records, government filings, and auction logs reveal a pattern that's hard to ignore. Each year, the major railroads submit detailed fleet counts in their Securities and Exchange Commission reports and Surface Transportation Board disclosures. These documents, dry as they may seem, quietly track the fate of thousands of locomotives. In the 2023 filings, Union Pacific's inventory dropped by nearly 14,000 units, a reduction echoed by similar declines in the rosters of CSX and BNSF. The numbers are corroborated by Surface Transportation Board mandated locomotive disposition reports, which now require railroads to state whether a unit is scrapped, sold, leased, or held in storage. Cross-referencing these filings with auction logs and railfan databases, a consistent story emerges. The majority of retired units do not return to service. Auction houses such as Iron Planet and RR Auction post weekly sales of locomotives, but the volume pales in comparison to the number of retirements. Over a recent 15-year period, analysts identified about 2,600 units sold to short line operators and around 1,200 transferred to leasing firms. Yet scrapyard manifests and satellite imagery of major dismantling facilities reveal that roughly 60% of all retired units are processed for metal recovery. These figures align closely with the asset disposition expenses listed in annual financial statements and with the reported surge in scrap metal revenue, $78.6 million in 2025 alone, an all-time high for the industry. In these records, the alternate paths stand out by their rarity. Leasing and rebuild channels exist, but they are specialized. National Railway Equipment Company reports receiving about 1,100 former Class I locomotives per year for overhaul, a fraction of the total. Export manifests show a trickle of units shipped to Brazil or Africa, often after extensive refurbishment and through dedicated brokers, rather than open resale. The Surface Transportation Board data on deadline storage, units parked indefinitely, neither scrapped nor sold, adds yet another layer. But even these engines tend to disappear from the books within a year or two. Their final destination usually a scrapyard. The paper trail is clear. While the appetite for used locomotives exists, the supply is tightly managed. The records themselves act as a witness, documenting an industry where the default outcome for a retired locomotive is destruction, not redistribution. Leasing, rebuilding, and export offer narrow escape routes, but the main highway leads straight to the torch. The logic, written in filings and manifests, is not about mechanical wear or market demand. It's about control, who gets to run, who gets to grow, and who is kept waiting at the gate. Today, a handful of powerful railroads still choose to dismantle working engines, even as some units quietly find new life abroad or with smaller lines. Each locomotive sent to the torch is a calculated move, one that values control over collaboration, scarcity over surplus. In an industry where leverage is everything, destruction is not wasteful. It is strategic. And as consolidation deepens, the real question is, who decides what is truly too valuable to share? Share your thoughts below.